Right, welcome Alex Mizrahi, CTO of ChromaWay, and we're going to talk a little bit about Chromapolis. And I have some questions here, but I guess you have many ideas and thoughts that would be interesting as well. So one thing I wondered about, there are many blockchain offerings now, and all kinds of different systems, Ethereum, EOS, and whatever. What's special about Chromapolis?
Well, we are trying to be very pragmatic about our approach, and we aim to build exactly the feature set to enable a mainstream applications. So we are choosing the trade-offs and the overall architecture of the system to enable basically to enable the system to support massive applications of different kinds. Of course, each blockchain chooses different trade-offs. Like Bitcoin is very conservative, and for this reason, it's somewhat slow and basically doesn't have much features. Ethereum also aims for certain kind of scenarios, and we are targeting decentralized applications, and we want to bring the resource cost down by choosing the right trade-offs to make it possible.
So what does Chromapolis look like under the hood? I heard something about, well, of course I know, but there's a relational database somewhere in there.
Yeah, so Chromapolis under the hood, it's based actually on post-chain framework, which ChromaWay have been developing for a while, and it uses relational database for storage. So in Chromapolis, we also have a programming language called RHEL, which is built specifically for blockchain and to support relational database under the hood. So we store blockchain state in a relational database, and we allow programmer to access it in same way he would do access the database in a regular application. So he can use indexes, he can use data structures like tables, links between tables. So for this reason, Chromapolis is probably much better at modeling complex applications where you have a lot of different entities which link with links between them and so on. This is something which might be harder to code in other systems, but we made it to make it basically give powerful tools to programmers, so they can program it the way they want and don't feel restrained by the system.
So if I'm a Dapp developer and I have something running on people's phones or whatever, and I make a transaction or some kind of message to the blockchain, the relational database underpinnings, would it mean that I could make more powerful transactions that have bigger effects or more powerful effects?
Yes, in Chromapolis we do not have very finally defined like metrics for performance, so we do not measure it on micro level. And we enable like query language, which is almost as powerful as SQL. So one query can do a lot of things. It can access a lot of data, and it can be, of course, the more data you access, the slower it's going to be. But in the end, like we can provide enough resources for it to work well. In like realistic applications, they can basically access to much more resources because each query is going to be optimized by the relational database. So this is something which relational databases do well. So this queries can perform quite well.
So if I send in one transaction to Chromapolis, it could mutate a whole lot of accounts or something. You wouldn't need to iterate with many transactions or...
Yes. For example, like often you have, like in financial applications, you don't have, like, let's say, there are some transactions are localized, like you have like just a payment, and other are not localized, like you paying dividends. You need to paid to every shareholder. You have like clearing in a derivative exchange. You have like daily clearing, and you clear all accounts. So on Chromapolis, you can make this more powerful transactions which update all accounts. Of course, it's going to take some time, but it's still possible. So even if you have like million accounts, that's not a very large amount for a relational database. So it's feasible to do this update every like once per day. Let's say that's how often you want to clear, I guess. And also, let's say in game world, you can update like all units in this game world to basically update their state, and you want to do this periodically, like each some minutes or hours. That's also feasible in Chromapolis.
Okay, so it's more powerful in that way, that a single transaction or query can do a lot of work, basically, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah.
So could you make like, we're talking about games, but I'm also a bit curious about, things like Twitter or Reddit. Is that something that could be made on top of Chromapolis or as a Dapp in Chromapolis?
Yes, I see no problem with it, as long as data basically the hardest problem in blockchain space is privacy, and this is something which is not relevant to public websites like Twitter or Reddit, so they can be made public. And now the limiting factor, let's say if you try to make it on Ethereum, that each post will cost you money. And on Chromapolis, it just brings the resource cost down to make it feasible to create like subscription model where user can just pay for account for like 1 year. Do not worry how many tweets he sends out. We can also do this indexing, which is kind of very relevant to these applications, to quickly retrieve like below a second latency, which is what users usually want. Retrieve exactly the posts together with information about like likes or upvotes. And yeah, with the power of relational database, we can accomplish this goal.
Interesting. So you wouldn't pay gas or anything like that on Chromapolis, or could you, or are you supposed to? Or?
Yes, well, it's basically, it's like there are multiple layers. So application itself, it pays for its hosting costs, but user, and then it's free to charge the user. So for example, application can make it free for users if it has already get sufficient amount of tokens to pay for its hosting costs. Or it can charge, let's say, once per year, and then basically this kind of hosting costs will be spread among all the users. And since actually like marginal cost per one transaction is very low, then we do not need to meter it, and we can just allow basically application can survive that way. Maybe some user uses it a little bit more, maybe somebody a little bit less, but all users, they create value for the platform. Even let's say if you are only reading, you are the audience, or maybe you're writing. So basically users contribute in different ways. So it doesn't make sense to penalize people who write more stuff because they make it more useful, the platform. So I think this kind of model makes a lot of sense for social media applications.
What does it mean that an application has hosting costs?
Well, in Chromapolis we have nodes which are run by providers, and they, of course, they cost money, so they need, basically providers need to pay for them.
So a Dapp has one node or many nodes?
A Dapp has an account in tokens, basically, which is used for its hosting costs, and multiple, basically one Dapp, it needs, of course, multiple nodes to be decentralized.
So it's like its own blockchain or something?
Yes, yes. Each Dapp has its own blockchain, which is hosted on a number of nodes. So let's say it can be like 10 nodes, for example. Mm-hmm. So you can be secure against nodes going down or being compromised. You still have this resilience. And Dapp pays for basically compensates the nodes for resources it consumes. So owners of this node will get compensation from the Dapps.
So each Dapp has its own nodes, which is a blockchain in itself, maybe 10 nodes or whatever, something like that.
Yeah, one node it can host multiple blockchains at the same time. And each Dapp is basically like its own blockchain. So we have like many-to-many relationship between nodes and blockchains.
What are the advantages of a Dapp having its own blockchain?
Well, first of all, it's not basically it's not so much. I would say, what are advantages of having one blockchain? That's the question, because with many blockchains, of course, you have a lot more flexibility. So the issue with Bitcoin or Ethereum is that they didn't know how to make multiple blockchains secure. They need like monolithic system, but we don't have this limitation. We have consensus, which can basically multi-level hybrid consensus, which can process multiple blockchains. And the advantage is that you can manage resources more freely. You can scale it horizontally. So the more, let's say, if you have many blockchains, many apps, you can just add more nodes. And like if you add twice more nodes, we can host twice more applications. So if there is a demand, it's like open market. It will create supply of these nodes. And in the end, I guess, so there is no like fundamental limit on scalability. Potentially we can process infinite number of transactions, assuming that there is enough paying demand and enough paying nodes. Basically, it can work that way.
So it's like sharding in a way, is it?
Well, with sharding, usually people talk about having same structure, basically split into multiple sections, but they are all functionally the same. But with a multi-blockchain approach, you have different blockchains. So each of them has different rules. So they're not shards. Each of them have different rules. They can have different like business model, running different code, different configuration, and so on. So it's a lot more flexible. But yeah, potentially we can also use it for sharding. So if you have application which outgrew a single blockchain, it can simply run multiple copies of itself and synchronize between them. So this way we can also use the same mechanism for sharding as well, although it's maybe a bit more complex or less complex depending on particular application.
So sharding, as you put it, is more like a load balancing thing, but what Chromapolis is doing is actually separating on a Dapp level, thinking that most communication in a Dapp will be in the Dapp. But can different Dapps communicate with one another?
Yes, so there are actually two ways to communicate. First is one Dapp can read data from another Dapp hosted on the same node. It has its limitations because basically it creates a dependency between Dapps. But this is something.
Would that be like a high bandwidth version of interoperation between
yes,
Dapps?
but it's like read-only. You can only read data, and it has to be like you need a hierarchy. So if they can't read each other's data because that would be a cross dependency, which is harder to manage. But yeah, if you need this data very often, then it's very high bandwidth mode. And another mode is that we just get assertion. So basically, one Dapp will signers nodes of the running the Dapp. They will sign the data. And then the user himself, because he is interested in carrying out that transaction, he can move this proof the transaction was processed with certain inputs. He can move this proof to another Dapp. And then this Dapp can verify this proof and can apply this data to its state. So it works in Chromapolis because all Dapps they share. On the system level, there is a directory with all the signers, all the nodes and Dapps. So a Dapp can verify that this data was actually signed by people or nodes which were supposed to sign it. So this mechanism allows this interoperation between arbitrary Dapps.
And this is not the same as cross-chain atomic swaps, or is it?
There is some similarity. but cross-chain atomic swaps, it's like very narrow concept. It applies to token transfers. So basically it's a script, and it requires like several phases. It's like very specific thing which requires several phases. As at first, one person needs to prepare for a particular transaction for a particular person, generate a unique key, and then they both commit this basically transaction. And it also has this limitation in terms of things can go wrong, and then people need to wait, or maybe they will be basically lose their money. With like we are dealing with more general concepts. It's not limited to tokens. It doesn't require as much setup. It can work with arbitrary data from applications, so much more general approach. But yeah, it's our limitation is that it's tied to Chromapolis, so it won't work. Basically, if we deal with another chain, we would have to go in a more traditional, basically, way.